Hello everyone, welcome to the next lesson of our Spring Security course. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the two-factor authentication, right? So the first thing is logical question is what is a two-factor authentication? So it's an additional layer of a security for your application where during the login process, not only you ask for a username and password, but you ask some additional things in order where that thing is only accessible to the customer. Either it could be your email ID, it could be your phone, or some other another things. Okay. And the question is, why do we need multiple authentication steps, right? With all these kind of challenges, security challenges and other things, it's becoming more logical steps to have additional layer of a security. What happens if your username and passwords are compromised, right? That means the hackers or someone who has that access will directly gain access to your account. So we are adding some additional layer for securities, and there are multiple variation of this two-factor authentication. Simplest being is sending out a token on your email ID, and then you fill that information and we let you in. Another one which is more popular is the system generates some kind of a QR code on your registration. You scan that QR code using some apps like a Google Authenticator. It generates a time-based tokens. I think it's a 30 seconds. It will keep on refreshing every 30 seconds. You fill that token during the login process. If everything is valid, we let you in. And the last one is basically the SMS-based two-factor authentication, right? So Spring Security does not have any built-in or out-of-the-box feature, but it provides you the flexibility to integrate these kind of systems into the security mechanism. So we will be using some external API to generate these time-based one-time password which keep on refreshing like every 30 seconds or based upon our configurations, right? And these external APIs will also help us to validate these tokens once the customer fills in. So there will be a two-step process. Spring Security will do the same login and password based authentication, and these APIs will help us to validate that token. All right. So we will be making a couple of changes to our application. One of them is making changes to the customer data model, where we will be storing some information, and we will talk about that. Okay. We will be creating a custom authentication provider because that's the logical thing where we should put this additional authentication logic, right? Because we are still authenticating a customer. All right. So we will be creating a custom authentication provider. And the last thing is our login and registration process will have a change. So login process will have a additional parameters on top of the username and password, and the registration process will give you that QR code on the successful registration. I think let's get started. So the first thing is, as I said, we are going to use some external API which is going to help us generate these time-based token. I'm using this one. Feel free to explore and use any other such APIs which fits into your use cases. Okay, so I'm just adding into our pom.xml file. Okay, thing is our user profile. Okay, in our user profile I'm going to add two additional attributes. Okay, and these are MFA enabled. This help us to find to tell whether two-factor authentication is active for this customer, and then we can hide or show those token details onto the front end. So this is applicable especially, let's say, if you have a multiple authentication in your system. For example, this user is an internal user and being verified using the SSO only, right? Then you don't need probably MFA. Secret, this is the key generated by this external API during registration process, and we store this secret onto the customer profile. I will be talking about where this will be used, but this is one of the key factor in our entire change. All right. So let's go to our Mfa Token Manager. So this is a new implementation which will be in place, right? And this will help us to do couple of things. All this code is based upon this external API, so this might change. the classes might change, or the few little things will be changed based upon how that external API is generating those things, but the entire logic or the concept is going to remain same. Okay, so the first thing is generating this secret. Okay, so this will be generated during the registration process. If your registration is successful, we call this service, it generates this secret, and we store this secret onto the customer profile. All right, the second thing is generating the QR code. So this is also a part of the registration process, where on a successful registration, we will show this QR code to the customer. They scan it using their mobile, and then it start generating those one-time passwords. So you will be using some external, as I said, right, external apps, for example, Google Authenticator or any such authenticator which scan these QR code and start generating the tokens. Okay, so this is interesting. It needs certain information. One is the secret that was generated for a given customer, because QR code are generated based upon a customer profile. This is not a common code, okay, common QR code, right? So the secret is one thing. Then what kind of algorithms we are using, what is the length of the token that will be generated on your mobile application, that one-time password thing. Okay, and then for how long that token is valid. This is 30 seconds. You can change it based upon your requirements, right? The last part is the verifying that time-based token, right? So during login process, customer will fill that token. This is the token, and it also, this verification service need additional information, which is what is the secret that has been stored onto the customer profile. All right, so based upon those two information, it basically verify whether the token that was provided by the customer is a valid or not valid. All right, so the next logical step for our changes is the registration process. All right, so I have done a couple of changes already to save the time for this tutorial. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm first letting the registration process to work as is. I'm not going to change it. If the registration process is successful, it passes all the validations, everything else, the next step I'm going to call is our so I have extended a user service, and I have created this MFA setup. All right, let's go there. Okay, so nothing specific here. User is already registered. That means there will be a user entity or a user model, right? What I'm doing here is just checking, making one check, but the main thing is I'm creating this MFA data. So this data contains QR code information and the code. Okay, we'll talk about that, but let's see what I'm doing here is. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm basically getting the secret which is stored onto the customer profile, right? And then I'm generating the QR code. All right, and then sending it back. So the other thing during the registration process is, let me see if I can find that out. Yeah, so during the registration process, you see this step on this one, I'm setting a secret, and this is generated by our token manager. All right, which we talked earlier. Here it's generating this key. I'm storing this key onto the customer profile, and during the QR code generation, right, all I'm doing is getting this user, finding out the key, all right, and then generating the token and returning this token back to the controller. So from this MFA token, there are two things which is a part of this thing. Okay, one is the QR code in itself, which is where you can scan it. I'm also storing the QR code key, sending it back to the front end. And the reason for that one is, let's say your mobile application, a mobile app does not have the feature to scan it, or your camera is not working. So in that case, I'm giving a customer to manually enter the key. So this part is basically showing that key. All right, so this completes our first part, where if you do now a registration, a token or a QR code will be shown to you, right? So before we get into the more details, let's see how it looks like now. All right, so my application is started. I'm going to fill this detail, and on the successful registration it's going to give me the QR code as well. All right, so if you see on the successful registration, it's giving me a message along with this QR code. So I can scan this QR code to generate that one-time password, or let's say your scanner is not working, your camera is not working, you can manually fill this key, all right, to show it to let customer fill it manually. Okay, this onto the front end is it's a simple change. Okay, let me show that to you. Right, so this is the key, image one, right? This is the simple time I leave token, which is showing this this thing. Okay, and then the code is just a string. All right. The second thing now, the second part on our application is modifying our login process, where not only along with the username and password, we will also ask customer to provide the token. So we need to pass that token. All right. And as I said initially that we will be creating or extending one of the authentication provider. In this case it is going to be DAO authentication provider, because it's a form based application login process, right? We are going to extend that authentication provider and will fit in our additional validation logic into that provider. So let's break it into two parts. First is, what is the right way of collecting this additional information from the front end and passing it to the authenticator, and then how in my custom authentication provider I can use that information to add this additional security check. All right, so this is my login page, right? This is a standard login page. Only thing which I am going to do additionally is I added this input field. I'm naming it as a JDG custom token. You can name it whatever you want. There is no naming restriction to this field, similar to for example the username and password. Okay, because this is a custom field, you can name it whatever field you want it. All right, now the next thing which is really critical is how I can pass this information to Spring Security. So there are multiple ways. For example, you can use the filter, which is the entry point, right? Username and password filter, which is authentication, which is the entry point for your login process, to collect that information, right, and pass it on. And there are a few other things. So we're going to talk about a specific approach in this case, which fits in our criteria. Okay, so there is a very elegant way in Spring Security. So all your authentication information is passed to the Spring Security using this authentication details source. Okay, and there are few and there are already a few implementation provided by Spring Security. One of them is a web authentication detail. Let me see if I can find it out. Yeah. So here you go. So this is one of the implementation of your authentication detail source. So what it does is basically when you fill all the information, it helps you to get that information, send it back to the Spring Security authentication framework. Okay. So we are going to extend it, and I am going to talk briefly about this one. Probably we'll cover it in more detail in some other video. What it is going to do is, if you see I'm overriding it, it provides you the way to build that additional information on top of it. It passes you the HTTP servlet request, and then it lets you to build any additional information onto the standard authentication object that is being collected and passed on by the Spring. All right, so we are extending that or implementing it, and as I said, web authentication detail source is provided out of the box by Spring Security, but we are going to create our custom one. All right, and within that one I am using this another detail object which is going to contain all that information. Okay, additional information. Let's go there. It's as simple as that. Look at this one. It's Very simple, right? And again, I am extending the web authentication detail. If you are interested, you can go here. It basically it controls that additional information, for example, session ID and remote address, but we'll talk about that maybe when I cover it in more details. The process is very simple. Because I'm extending web authentication detail, I'm not doing a lot of things here. Okay, I'm just basically passing this information. I'm calling super to let super do whatever they want to do, and on last thing, I'm getting this custom token which is submitted into the form from the request, because you have access to the HTTP request, right? I get that information from the HTTP request and store it into the token. That's the simple thing I'm going. There are a few other requirements when you are basically extending this web authentication details. You have to provide a toString equals hash code. These are standard mechanisms. You know what needs to be done there. Okay. The other thing now, you have created it, right? But how does Spring Security know that it needs this, or it should use this custom web authentication detail to pass on this additional information to the underlying authentication mechanism, right? For that one, if you remember, we are building all the configurations are built into the authentication into our app security, which extends the web security configuration adapter. So what I'm doing is, if you see, I am basically injecting this custom web authentication detail source into this class. The last logical thing what I'm going to do here is, I'm telling during the form login process, this is the login form configuration, right? I'm telling Spring Security that you don't use your out of the box authentication detail source, but use my custom authentication detail source. All right, so this is what I'm doing. If you don't do it, Spring Security will use the web authentication detail source, which is out of the box, so it don't know how to get that additional information or the token from the request parameter. Okay, I think we are almost there. Now the last step is, how should I validate that token, right? What is the right way? Where should I put my logic to validate the token, that time based or other whatever way you're generating that token, right? And I think the logical step for all these cases is the authentication provider, because that is actually doing the authentication, right? So I have a multiple ways. Create authentication provider from the scratch, put all the logic into that thing, but that's too complicated, and that means I'm not using a lot of the feature which is provided by the Spring Security. So what are my options, right? I think the logical option is to extending the authentication provider which is close to your implementation, and fill or put your additional logic there. Okay, so in our case, because it's a form based login process, so if you remember from our previous lessons, the form based authentication providers are, or the form based authentication is handled through the DAO authentication provider. So what I'm doing here is, I'm creating a custom authentication provider, but instead of writing everything from the scratch, I'm extending a DAO authentication provider, and that should be your logical step, right? If you are using a LDAP, you should be extending a LDAP authentication provider. Or if you're using some external thing based upon what kind of a provider is already available, extend it. Okay, now I don't want the core authentication mechanism that is used by the Spring Security. I don't want to change it. Okay, so I'm not touching that logic. Okay, what I'm doing here is, if you go to the DAO authentication provider, okay, so there are these methods: additional authentication check, and there is I think one of them is post and one of them is pre. So I'm going to utilize those one. I will let Spring Security to do its work. Okay, and then on top of it, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use this custom authentication provider to do my additional logic. So you see, additional authentication check, right? I'm using this method here. What I'm doing is, it basically gets the user detail information, right? and then it also get the token. And you remember this basically is a wrapper around the authentication detail. I'm calling a super here. Now this authentication detail, right, this one, this authentication object, right, this authentication object is nothing but what Spring Security basically collect and pass to the underlying security mechanism. And in this case we have already told Spring Security that, hey, use my authentication detail source. All right, so we are not going to utilize that thing. Okay, so what we are doing here is we know that this is a type of customer web authentication detail, so we are just typecasting it, getting this authentication. All right, and then user detail is nothing but the user information that is sent by the Spring Security back to us once the authentication is successful. So it basically use that user detail service. I'm going to touch base on that one. Okay, so it's as simple as that, right? We already store that token. I'm getting that token from this user. I'm getting the secret which is stored into the customer profile, and using my token manager, I verify the token. If the token is valid, I don't have to do anything. Let Spring Security go to the next logical step and setting the sessions and the security token and all sort of things. If it's not valid, I don't want to tell customer that, hey, your token is not valid, right? I don't want to give them a hint. So rather we will be sending a generic message which is a bad credential exceptions. Okay, now few more things before we wrap up this thing. Okay, so one is our user detail service. Okay, I have done a little change onto the user detail service, which is responsive, which is used by our DAO authentication provider to load the customer based upon the ID, right? And then it verified it. So I have done a few changes, and if you see our custom authentication detail, so this is the user detail service sent by the DAO authentication provider, right? Or ultimately this is built by the user detail service, and if you see, we are getting this token from this user detail, right? So what I have done here on the user detail service is I have done a little change to that one. Okay, let's see what is there. Okay, so if everything is valid, what I am doing here is I am adding a secret. Okay, the secret which is generated during the registration process, right, and stored onto the customer profile. So we need this secret on top of the token which is sent by the customer. So if everything works fine in our user detail service, what I am doing is I am filling that information so my custom authentication provider can use it. All right, so now I have my customer custom authentication provider. It's verifying the that token detail, sending out information, sending out an error or exception in case it's not valid, right? Now the last step on all these information is going back to our security configuration and now telling Spring Security that, hey, use my custom authentication provider. All right, because that's how the Spring Security know that which authentication provider it should use. Okay, so I have configured this authentication provider here. Now the last step on this one is telling the Spring Security that, hey, use my custom authentication provider. So for this one, give me a second. All right, here is a step. So there is already an Authentication Manager builder which help us. This is provided by the Spring Security. It help us to build all these additional things within the Spring Security. So what I'm telling Spring Security is that, hey, use this custom authentication provider for your authentication process. All right, so those are all the changes which are required. Now if you go to the front end application, right, this one, and if I go to the login process, okay, if I, let's say, put some random token here, all right, and if I try to sign in, the system will throw me a error saying, hey, your thing is not valid. That gives you an idea how to implement a multi-factor authentication in your Spring Security application. The source code of this tutorial will be available on the GitHub repository. If you have any question, feel free to add a comment, and I should be more than happy to help you on that one. I hope this will help you to implement it in your real life project. And if you like my series, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and share with other users. Thanks for watching this tutorial.